Winter on the Wyoming line will test a man, but tonight it knocks. Small, hungry, holding a rag doll. Watch Virgil Hart, widowed, broke, choose bread over silence, offense over fear, and, before a hard-eyed town, lay his late wife's ring on a table. Stay. This fire has something to say. Wind combed the cottonwoods like a saw blade, and the shack at Willow Draw took the cutting without complaint. Virgil Hart sat close to the box stove, boots set wide, the day's work still in his joints, and the day's numbers still in his head. Wood smoke hung low as a blanket. On the shelf above the stove rode a single cold loaf, tough as a saddle heel. He'd been saving it, carving off slivers with the care of a man who owned more silence than bread. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. The knock hardly qualified as one, 3 shy taps that could have been a twig. He would have let it pass, except the quiet inside him heard it almost different. The hinge gave its long, old whine when he opened up. She stood there small as a fence post, dressed the gray of road dust, a ragged doll pressed against her ribs. A boy hung to her sleeve, eyes big and hollowed, cheeks chalky. Snow had salted both their hair. The girl lifted her face. "Sir, if you buy the doll, Toby can eat." Her voice fluttered like a moth at a lantern. Virgil looked from the girl to the boy and back, and felt that little empty room behind his ribs shift. He reckoned words weren't much use when a belly made its own argument. Still, the habit of a widower is to count what's left. He glanced at the shelf and the hard loaf riding it. "How long's he been without?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. 3 days, she said. She didn't cry. That told him more than tears would. Wind pushed a knife of cold past his boots. Somewhere behind him the stove ticked, reminding him a house is just a house until you warm somebody else in it. He stepped aside. "Come on in." They edged over the threshold like skittish colts. The boy's breath showed white. The girl kept a hand on him and another on that poor doll, which had one button eye and ribbon frayed down to threads. Virgil reached up and took the loaf down. The crust fought him, but he broke it anyway, thumb grinding against palm until it gave. Firelight hit the torn face of it and made it look better than it was. "The doll stays," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He put half the loaf in the girl's hands and set the smaller piece on a tin plate for the boy. "You eat first. Reckon that's a fair trade." The girl didn't move for a breath, like a deer waiting to see if a creek would hold her weight. Then she tore a corner off and passed the larger to the boy. He fell on it with small, desperate teeth. The girl kept her eyes on Virgil a heartbeat longer, measuring the kind of man he might be, then took her own bite. They chewed, that's all. Bread sounds loud when you haven't got much. The stove ticked and settled, the hinge sighed shut against the wind. For a long half-minute nobody spoke. White breath thinned and faded. The doll stared at the fire with its one sure eye. Virgil watched their hands, red-knuckled, chafed, determined. He felt a piece of winter back off him. He'd been living like a man out of season, half here and half in the ground where his wife lay, counting debts instead of sheep. But a door is still a door, and it swings the way you push it. He ladled a dipper of warm water and passed it to the boy, then another to the girl. "Name's Virgil," he said, almost surprised to hear it. "You can set by the stove. Wind ain't got near the manners in here it does outside." A near smile came and went on the girl's mouth, quick as a quail. She pulled the boy closer to the heat, doll tucked tight. Virgil broke a last thumb of crust for himself and let it soften on his tongue. The bread tasted better than it had a right to, maybe because it wasn't his alone anymore. He closed the door against the night, and the hinge gave that long, thin whine again, like music played on a single string. Somewhere inside, something answered it. A man thinks he's got nothing left until someone smaller knocks and proves him wrong. He set another stick in the stove's mouth and watched the flame take hold. "Much obliged," the girl whispered, barely more than breath. He tipped his hat without touching it. "In here's fire," he said. "Out there's cold." The wind shouldered the walls and moved on. The room held, and Virgil Hart, who'd been forgetting how such things worked, remembered that a man can still open a door. They ate till the edge went off the hunger. The room settled into its small noises, the stove breathing, the wind skimming the chinks like a file on iron. Damp wood steamed where he'd set a green stick too close to the fire, a clean smell that said the snow outside had hands. Virgil dragged out an old trunk and lifted a patched quilt, the one that had outlived more winters than any of them. He shook it once and spread it near the stove, slow and careful, like laying a map for two travelers who'd walked too far. The boy's eyelids sagged at the sight. The girl tightened her tuck on the torn doll, ribbon worn to threads. "Ain't much of a hotel," Virgil said, easy as he could manage. "But the coffee don't talk back, and the clerk minds his own business." That earned him the smallest of looks, almost a smile, almost not. She hovered, then asked it quiet, as if the question might break if set down too hard. "Morning comes. You gonna send us out?" The wind pressed its ear to the wall. Virgil had to set the answer where it would hold. He met her eyes and kept his voice plain. "I don't turn children from the fire while the night's still cold." He tipped his chin toward the stove. "In here's fire, out there's cold. Scoot closer." Her shoulders let go a measure. She guided the boy onto the quilt, toes still pink from him. The road. Virgil rolled a small log into the stove's mouth. The hinge sang a thin note when he shut it. He poured a dipper of water, set it within reach, then eased back to the chair. He knew too well. For a time there wasn't any talking. The silence came on like snow. You don't notice it starting, just that everything's different once it lands. The wood smoke thickened kindly. Somewhere out in the draw, a coyote stitched two lonely calls together, and then thought better of it. The boy's breath turned soft as cat steps. The girl sat upright a long while, holding the doll like she was holding back the night. "You can sleep, miss," Virgil said, softer than he remembered he could be. "Fire'll hold." She nodded, but didn't lie down yet. "Mama said work keeps the heart from breaking." The words came like a thing learned by touch, and not by book. "Reckon your mama was right." She laid herself beside the boy, one arm over him, the doll snug between. The patched quilt took them both like it had been waiting. Virgil leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and watched the coals. He'd kept fires for stock in blizzards. He'd set out nights with a sick cow and with a sicker grief. But this keeping felt different. He fed the stove before it asked, as if a flame could promise what a man wasn't sure he could yet say. The wind worried the walls and then moved off in search of someone sturdier. The shack ticked and settled, close as a hand. Virgil stayed up with it. Truth was, he feared if the fire dwindled, the children might thin into smoke and be gone by morning, the way other good things had slipped through him. He set another stick, listened to it catch. "Much obliged," he said to no one in particular, and maybe to the night for sending the right knock to the right door. The girl finally slept. The boy sighed in a way that made the room warmer. Virgil Hart kept the fire till the hours lost their names, and for the first time in a long spell, the night felt like something a man could outlast. Dawn came the color of a bruise. Blue worked into gray until the lines between things softened. The stove had dozed down to a bank of coals. Virgil set the lid aside and fed it a stick. The fire woke polite, as if remembering there were small sleepers to mind. When he opened the door, the cold met him clean and sharp, air with a metal bite that lived in a man's teeth. He stepped out to the pump and dropped the handle. It answered with a long iron squeak, stubborn as an old mule. Then the water came slow and hard as truth. Back inside, he set a tin cup by the stove to take some edge off the chill. The shack smelled of damp wool and wood smoke and something like hope, thin but present. Lila sat up careful so as not to wake the boy. The doll lay between them like a small guard dog that had done an honest night's work. "You sleep any?" he asked. "A little," she said, voice hushed by the room. "He sleeps better when it's warm." She checked Toby's lips with a finger, the way women do when they've been taught by loss. The boy turned his face toward the heat and didn't wake. Virgil opened the flour sack and found what he expected, light like a pocket with the coin gone. Beans, too, not enough to brag on. He poured some into a pot with water from the pump, set it where the stove could talk sense into it. Thin stew is still stew if you take it slow. Leela watched him measure with a cowhand's caution, then looked down at the doll, smoothing the frayed ribbon as if it might lay straighter under her hand. After a while she said, "Mama got the cough. Sat up nights at first. Then she couldn't." The words came like fence staples, one, then the next, then the next. Folks said Papa went with the bottle 'fore Toby learned to walk. Mama didn't speak his name again. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Virgil nodded once. Plenty of men rode off in winter and called it weather. "You from town?" She shook her head. "From wherever Mama could find a roof," she said. Lila looked at the pot a moment, listening for something besides a simmer. She said work keeps the heart from breaking. She said if I couldn't lift a load, I could carry a corner. "Reckon your mama knew her business," Virgil said. He checked the beans, gave them a slow stir so they'd think about swelling. When the stew gave up a smell worth noticing, he set 2 tin plates and the tin cup, tore what remained of last night's crust into careful pieces. He scooped a thin ladle for each and slid 1 plate toward the girl. The boy stirred at the scent and the rattle of metal on wood. Lila steadied him with a palm between the shoulders. "Where's your share, girl?" Virgil asked when he saw her spoon hesitate. She didn't answer at first. Then she tilted her plate and without ceremony pushed the larger share onto Toby's. "He sleeps better warm and full, ain't that so?" Her face never asked for praise. It wasn't a choice so much as the way the world ran when you were the only hinge on a little boy's door. Something in Virgil eased and hurt at the same time. He'd buried a ring with a woman, and most days didn't think about the space that left, until a small thing leaned against it. He lifted his own spoon and made a show of tasting. "He won't lick the bottom of both plates if we do this right," he said, dry as a fence post. The corner of Lila's mouth moved. McMurtry would have called it a joke, trying not to be caught. They ate slow, the 3 of them, like time might grow if they didn't rush it. The stew didn't have much to say, but it said it honest. Every few breaths the pump's old squeak replayed in his ear, and the metal cold in the doorway reminded him of the ledger he kept. Beans, flour, wood, daylight, backbone. When the plates were scraped, he set them aside. No one spoke. The quiet put its hand back over the room, not heavy, not scolding, just a laying on of hands. Lila brushed crumbs from Toby's lip with her thumb. The boy leaned into it and almost smiled, his eyes still fogged with sleep. Virgil looked at the 2 of them and learned again a lesson a man keeps misplacing. Kindness don't talk, not when it counts. It stands there like winter ice, clear and strong, bearing weight without complaint. He drew a breath that tasted of wood smoke and iron and something close to purpose. "Much obliged," he said to the morning, or maybe to the stove for holding steady. He reached for the coffee tin, then thought better, save that for later. Work first, like the girl's mama said. There was fence to walk and a day to meet, but for now, he set another stick in the stove's mouth and watched the fire consider it. Then take hold. By late light, the day thinned to ribbon. Snow glow pressed at the small window and made the room feel underwater. Virgil raked the coals and let the stove breathe, then trimmed the wick on the lamp. Lamp oil put its clean, bitter smell in the air, a scent that always took him back the length of his life and a mile beyond. He dragged the old keepsake tin from the trunk, the one with a faded steer's head stamped on the lid. The lid stuck. He worried it with a thumb, and it popped free. Inside lay a needle and a tangle of thread, 2 coins he hadn't trusted to spend, and the small circle he hadn't trusted himself to touch. The needle skittered across the tin with a tiny tick-tick like a cricket trapped in summer. He steadied it with a finger, then lifted the other thing. The wedding ring was plain yellow and honest as prairie grass in August. It had warmed to his skin before he realized he'd been holding it that long. He didn't look at it much, hadn't needed help remembering. But looking and remembering aren't the same work. A man learns. Lila sat quiet on the quilt, the torn doll in her lap. Her hands tried to smooth what couldn't be smoothed, ribbon frayed to last threads. Toby slept close, cheek to the patchwork, his breath a soft saw-cutting little boards. Virgil cleared his throat of something that wasn't there and crouched. "That ribbon got any life left in it?" he asked, more to get his voice used than to hear the answer. He worked the needle's point under the loose weave, not to sew, but to open a path. The needle tapped the tin again when he set it aside. He slid the ring through the tired loop and eased it down against the doll's chest, where a heart would be if such things enjoyed the privilege. Firelight took to the ring like a friend who'd known it all along. Gold caught the red and threw it back gentled. Lila's eyes gathered that light and kept it. "She can see again," the girl whispered, as if sound might scare the moment off. Virgil studied the little pendant he'd made without meaning to. He wasn't much for craft, a straight nail, a firm post, that was his range. This here was finer than he had hands for. "This ring keeps its word better than I talk," he said. "Reckon that's the truth of it." Lila never looked away from the doll. "She's watchin' if you keep yours." He felt it, the weight and the rightness together. Some promises are just smoke until you hang a piece of metal on them. He reached and tugged the ribbon's knot so the ring would ride true. Toby shifted, sighed, kept sleeping. No one said anything for a run of heartbeats. The lamp oil carried its clean bite, the stove ticked easy, and the ring turned once, slow, catching 3 small fires, the wick, the coals, and the look in a child's face. Virgil let the quiet hold, counted to the end of it, then let it go on a little further for good measure. "Doll's seen worse fashion," he said finally, deadpan as a fence post, which earned him the ghost of a grin that might grow up to be a smile by spring. He nodded to the ring. "She'll do." He set the tin back in the trunk and closed it gentle, like laying down a tool that had done a day's job. The ring hung where it was meant to hang for now, not in a box, not in the ground, but on a rag doll between 2 small ribs, a bright eye that could not close. Private grief is a hard horse to halter. Sometimes it stands, sometimes it throws you. Tonight it stood. He could lead it a little way, far enough to hand the rope to someone smaller who would carry it different. He fed the stove, watched flame take, and felt the shack gather itself around the 3 of them the way a man gathers a coat in wind. Outside, snow kept its counsel. Inside, there was light enough. By noon, the road into Sage Hollow went to slush. Wagon ruts glazed with grit and thaw, a mess that took your boots like it meant to keep them. Sawdust lay thick outside the saloon to keep men on their feet and out of lawsuits. Across the street, the church bell, all wood and will, knocked the cold air with a patient hand. Fresh bread pushed its warm breath through the mercantile door seams, the kind of smell that could make a man remember better times against his will. Virgil carried the boy a spell and let him down when the lad reached for the snow like it was sugar. Lila kept pace, the doll at her ribs. the ribbon bearing a gold ring that caught a shard of sun and threw it back mild. She didn't flaunt it. She let it be what it was. Inside the mercantile, the room held barrels and order and Mr. Whitcomb's thin idea of mercy. The counter ran tall and scarred. Behind it, Whitcomb wore his ledger the way other men wore a gun. He believed in two things, the price marked and the line kept. Virgil set his silver spur on the counter, last of the pair, the leather still smelling faintly of horse and sweat and days he'd rather keep. Whitcomb leaned in without touching it. "Flour for the spur," he said, voice dry enough to start a grass fire. His eyes cut past Virgil to the children and came back sharper. "Apples, you can't." The bin of bruised apples by the window showed their soft places like old men show scars, red all the same. Lila's gaze hung on them the way a hand hangs on a warm cup. She didn't ask. She didn't have to. The asking had been done on the road, at doors that didn't open. Mrs. Trudy Finch stood at the thread cabinet, lips tight as a new seam. She measured Lila's hem with her eyes and found it short of her notion of church. "Some sights," she said to the spools, "ain't fit for Sunday." The words were pins meant to prick and be denied. On the boardwalk outside, Horace Wilkes paused like chance had set him there. Bankers don't favor chance. They prefer schedules and signatures. He watched through the glass with a face that took no cold at all and disliked anything that warmed without permission. Decency shown to a poor man's account unsettled him. It threw off his figures. Whitcomb drew a sack close and leveled it on the scale. Weight settled. Needle eased into truth. Virgil waited with the patience of a man who'd slept on worse floors and argued with worse winds. He could feel Lila's eyes tug sideways toward the apples and kept his own where they needed to be. "Flour's enough," he said, taking the sack when Whitcomb tied it neat. "Much obliged." The line carried no pride and no apology. It was the middle ground a man stands on when the banks on either side wash out. They stepped into the day, door hinge giving a long country whine. The bell down the street put a slow knock in the air, each strike laying another board under their feet. Lila's glance flicked back to the window, one last look at the red she wasn't owed, and then forward again. The ring on the doll's ribbon threw a small light on the inside of the glass, and was gone. No one spoke for a stretch that would hold 20 heartbeats. Boots worked through slush. Wagon wheels chewed the ruts. Trudy Finch's words fell behind them like threads that wouldn't catch. Wilkes turned away, deciding the weather. Whitcomb's door sighed shut, pleased to have done exact business. Virgil shifted the flour to his shoulder, felt the pull in old rope-burned places, and straightened into it. A man can carry more if he carries it upright. He didn't look smaller without the spur. He looked like somebody who'd traded proper and kept his say. Lila slipped her hand around Toby's and set their little parade toward the road out. The church bell let go one last time and held the note as far as it could. "Flour will do," Virgil said again, but only to the wind, and the wind, having other matters, took it without argument. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. Where the noon slush had stiffened, Virgil packed the flour high on his shoulder and let the wind make up its mind about him. By the time they hit Willow Draw, the breeze had turned into something with teeth. Wire on the north line sang a thin, uneasy note, the kind a man hears in his sleep. He set the flour just inside the door. "Buyer first," he told Lila, but the fence said otherwise with a hard metallic twang like a banjo string popped by a rough hand. He looked to the line and saw a corner post listing and a span of rusted barbed wire bowing out like a belly full of wind. "Stay close to the stove," he said, then saw the girl already pulling on the mitts that weren't from hers. The doll rode her ribs, the ring under her coat. Toby planted himself in the doorway as if the house had grown a small door guard. Virgil hit the yard at a trot, boots punching through crust, breath cutting white. The smell of smoke from Nora's forge drifted faint from town, or maybe it rode in with memory. Either way, it steeled him. He got both hands under the top rail and shouldered it up, wood biting into bone. The post groaned. The wire sang higher. A sleigh runner whispered on snow. Zeke Turner came shouldering a bundle of dry wood, hat down to his eyebrows. "Heard your wire carrying a tune clear to the cottonwoods," he said around a grin that had mischief in it. "Rumor in this valley boils quicker than soup." "Fix the fence first. Talk later," Virgil said, jaw tight, not unkind. "Fair," Zeke allowed, already swinging off to cut a brace. Hoof, clop, leather creak. Nora Kincaid came in with a swayback mare and a sledge piled with forged nails, new wire, and a set of mean-looking pliers. Her coat held the day's forge smoke, a warm iron scent. "Brought nails straight as Sunday," she said. "You keep the rail, and I'll make the bite." Lila slid to her knees in the drift, hand out for a nail. Virgil almost told her no, then swallowed the word. A body learns when to let help be help. He bore the rail with his shoulder, the muscle along his neck burning like a green brand. Lila set a nail true against the brace post, knuckles red, jaw firm. Nora leaned in, hammer lifting and dropping with a blacksmith's clean authority. Hammer thuds, swallowed by the wind. Zeke came back with a cut brace and drove it home with his boot heel and a short-handled maul, every blow a sentence that didn't need words. The wire still bellied. Nora's pliers bit it. She twisted until the barbs drew tight and the old iron found its temper again. Snow lifted in veils and ran past them to some other business. Toby clapped from the doorway, mittened hands making a soft pat like praise, too small for church, but big enough for home. "Hold her," Nora said. Virgil leaned harder into the rail. The post answered with a low complaint. Lila braced her shoulder to the brace the way a calf leans into its mama. Zeke slid a wedge under the brace foot and gave it one smart whack. The last brace bit. For a second the wind took its deepest breath of the hour and threw the whole field at them. The wire, the posts, the people nailed to their places. The fence held. No one spoke for the length of half a prayer and half again. Only wind and breath. Virgil eased off the rail. Zeke set his hands on his hips and studied the line like he'd just signed his name to it. Nora tested each twist with the care of a woman who trusted iron and not much else. Lila sat back in the snow, mitts on her knees, looking smaller than the work and bigger than herself. "Well," Zeke said at last, "she'll stand till spring remembers us." "Spring's got a poor memory in these parts," Nora answered, a dry edge of humor riding the words. "Good thing we've got nails." Virgil pulled the glove off one hand and laid it flat on the top rail like a benediction. He felt the steady run of the wire through the wood, a quiet music where before there'd been fret. He looked from Zeke to Nora to Lila. A man can mistake loneliness for truth if he lets it sit too long. Turns out some jobs take many hands, and the doing is the only argument worth making. He nodded his thanks with the economy of a man who'd spent most of his words already. "Much obliged," he said, and it went to all of them, their backs, their tools, their time. They tramped back toward the shack. Toby ducked inside at last, content the world would not blow away before supper. Lila paused and looked up the run of fence. Posts, square, wire-tight, the line holding its own against a day that tried to unmake it. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Grown folks had done a thawing. Virgil shouldered the door, and the hinge gave its long, faithful whine. Heat rolled out. Behind them, the fence sang only the low note fences sing when they're satisfied, and the wind, finding no easy purchase, moved on. Evening shouldered down on Willow Draw while the fence sang its low, satisfied note. Supper had a way of tasting better after a job stood up to the wind. Virgil cut the beans thin and let them fatten slow on the stove. The shack breathed easy. Kerosene from the lamp threaded a clean sting through the wood smoke, like a reminder that light costs something. Boot steps came steady to the stoop, measured, lawman playing. Then the boot soles thumped the step, snow squeaked, and a knuckle found the door with 3 tidy taps. Virgil set the spoon aside and opened up on the hinges long homespun wine. Marshal Eli Dunn stood square in the frame, hat brim carrying the last of the day. His coat held a ghost of cold and courthouse dust. "Evenin', Virgil." He tipped 2 fingers, eyes sliding a polite inch toward the children and back, as if not to make too much of what he plainly saw. He unfolded a posted notice, paper lifting a dry rasp in the wind. "Town Hall wants a word," he said. "Just questions." Virgil didn't crowd the space with talk. He felt Lila step up behind him, light as a little shadow, the doll tucked in her elbow, the ringed ribbon hid under her coat, but not the way it shone under her ribs. Toby pressed a mitten to his mouth and watched the marshal like boys size up the weather. "Questions get answers," Virgil said. "I'll stand. Reckon that's fair." Eli's mouth twitched, something near approval that wouldn't quite be caught. "Didn't figure you'd slip the back way," he said. "Lamp up. It's cold down there." When the marshal's shape moved off the stoop, the wind filled the hole he left. For a handful of breaths, nobody spoke. The notice lay on the table where the marshal had set it, edges lifting a little when the draft nudged it, like the paper wanted to ride the air back to town. Lila eyed the print the way poor folks eye a menu, careful of hope and salt. "We got to go now?" she asked. "Soon as we can finish being warm," Virgil said. He handed Toby his cap, pulled Lila's hood snug, then banked the fire so the shack would keep its own counsel while they were gone. He took the notice and folded it once, slow and square, as if the creases might grant a measure of sense to what waited. They stepped out into a town that had lit itself against the dark. Windows along the road burned small and steady, each one a yellow eye in the snow. Lamps hissed along Main, and the sky above Sage Hollow looked full of tin stars flicked by a careless hand. The church bell kept its tongue this hour, letting the lamps do the speaking. At the double doors of Town Hall, a few men smoked with their collars high, talk drifting thin and harmless as fog until it hit wood. Virgil felt the old weight take its place between his shoulder blades. Debt, loss, the arithmetic of bread and winter, and then he shifted his stance and made room for another weight beside it. Choice. He reached for the handle. The doors swung wide, hinges giving a muloy complaint, and a sheet of cold poured through the room and over a crowd that turned as one to see who had come in with the night. Lamps threw brass-colored circles on faces he knew from the price of hay and the funeral hill. The hall was all plank and echo. Every breath showed white for a beat before it learned the warmth. For a stretch, nobody said a thing. You could hear the lamps burn, the small hiss like far-off rain, the chair legs settling, a cough someone swallowed on purpose. Lila's glove found Virgil's sleeve. Toby drew closer against his leg. The doll watched with its one true eye, and the ring he'd set to it, hidden but felt. "Just questions," Marshal Eli said from near the long table, as if to oil the gears before they started. Virgil took one step, then two, boots slow on old boards. He set his hat back a notch so they could see his face. A man's got to pick how he'll be looked at. He chose to be looked at standing up. "All right," he said to the room that had fed him. Wages and talk in about equal measure. "Ask 'em." The silence held one beat longer, respectful or curious or both. Then the hall breathed in together and the night moved again, but different. Whatever fear had trailed them from the shack, thin, nagging, stayed on the stoop like a stray dog that knew the threshold wasn't its business. Virgil Hart squared himself to the table and to whatever talk a town keeps on tap. The lamps threw a good light. He didn't plan to waste it. Love this tale? Hit like, share, and subscribe to keep the West wild. The plank floor took Virgil's weight with a low groan, answering boot for boot. Oil lamps threw soft, honest circles, and the room smelled of wet wool, and road dust warmed back to life. At the far end, a scarred, long table held the town's habit of judgment, like it was a ledger that never closed. Chairs rasped as men settled into their notions. Mr. Whitcomb stood with his fingers on the table edge, the way a storekeep holds a scale level. His gaze squared up on the children before it measured Virgil. Horace Wilkes had that banker's stillness, hat brim just so, coat dry as arithmetic. Beside them, Mrs. Trudy Finch clutched her sewing basket like it might keep her above whatever tide this meeting aimed to raise. Reverend Amos Pike watched from a step back, hands quiet on a Bible he wasn't in a hurry to open. Marshall Dunn leaned one shoulder to a post and let the lamps do the talking. Whitcomb started first, voice flat enough to plain boards. "You taking in strays sets trouble in the street. Give you leeway, everyone'll want it. I got a counter. Counters run on rules." Wilkes let the corner of his mouth move, approval at the sound of policy. "Winter's a narrow plank, Mr. Hart. Winter won't carry your sentiments. Not and keep a town standing." Trudy's eyes flicked to Lila's hem, and then to the imagined look of Sunday pews. "There's dignity to the Lord's house," she said, thin and sharp as a needle. "Children ought to meet it proper." Virgil felt Lila draw in close at his side. Her glove went to the doll, and lamplight found the ring warm against its ribbon. One quick, quiet flash, like a thought unchanging its mind. The room tightened on that small glint. Even men who had no use for jewelry knew a pledge when it showed itself. No one filled the next space with words. You could hear the chairs rasp when folks shifted, could hear the lamps hiss like rain a mile off. Reverend Amos met Virgil's eyes and held them, not to lend him courage, not to borrow it, just to remind a man where he stood. "Can you feed 'em?" Wilkes pressed, voice oiled, reasonable as a trap. "Or do we let feeling set a precedent we can't afford?" Virgil set his palm flat on the table. The wood was scarred from other nights, other arguments, honest scars that didn't apologize for being made. He could talk. He could tell them about a door opening on a wind-hurt evening, about bread split and a fire kept because the dark asked for it. He could say what it cost to bury a ring and keep on breathing. Instead, he let his breath even out and kept his words where they'd do the most good. Back. Silence held a clean 15 count, long enough for temper to drain, short enough for backbone to stay up. His hand clenched and eased once on the grain. His wool sleeve whispered when he drew it back. The lamp flame shook and then steadied. Trudy's chin lowered a fraction. Not quite concession, not quite fight. Whitcomb's fingers flexed on the tabletop, merchant sense, arguing with something older than sense. Wilkes' eyes weighed the room and found no interest in the part of a man that can't be tallied. Virgil kept standing. That was the whole of it just then, standing where he said he would, letting a quiet answer the questions it could. If talk needed buying, he had one thing dear enough to pay for it. He felt its small circle like a coin against the breath of the night, and knew when the time came he'd wager what was dearest and not look away. "Ask what you need," he said at last, voice low enough to make men lean to hear. "I'll answer where it counts." The lamps steadied again. Somewhere a chair leg found its true place on the board. The room, which had come up tight as a wire in wind, slackened a hair. It wasn't surrender, it was space, just enough to set the next thing down without breaking it. The space that opened in the room held long enough for a small voice to fit. Lila slid out from Virgil's side, knees knocking together under her dress, the doll tucked to her ribs. Lamplight worked the ribbon and found the little glint beneath her coat. She looked at the table the way a thirsty thing looks at a creek, measuring if it could bear her weight. "He broke bread when no one would," she said. "Nothing else, nothing more." The words landed with the careful sound of truth set down on old boards. The hall smelled of old pine warmed out of the planks by 100 meetings like this one. A draft hissed at the door seam and went quiet when folks leaned in. Whitcomb's jaw on once and stopped. Trudy's hand softened on her sewing basket. Wilk's eyes narrowed, not cruel, just counting a new column he hadn't planned on. Virgil didn't talk. He reached for the ribbon and, slow enough for everyone to see he wasn't taking it back again, slipped the wedding ring free. It sat in his palm, a breath warm from the girl's keeping. Then he laid it on the table in front of the men who kept rules for a living. "Best thing I own," he said. "If my promise needs collateral, take it. Just don't take a child's supper." The room took that in and set it where it belonged. Floorboards creaked under the shift of bodies, not restless now, just making room. Reverend Amos stepped up like a man who knows when to use the few words he carries. He didn't lift the Bible high, he only let it open in his hands. "I was hungry, and you gave me food," he said. "I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." He shut the book soft, like you close a door you mean to open again. Something thawed. It wasn't loud. An old woman from the back came forward, set down a loaf with both hands, and slid it toward the ring. A teamster laid potatoes still dusty with the field he'd pulled them from. A seam of hands opened, and a jar of beans found its place. Nora Kincaid came out of the lamplight with a bundle of nails tied up neat, as if straight iron could be tithed. Zeke Turner shouldered through with a tie of seasoned wood, set it down with a short grunt and a grin that didn't apologize for liking the work. Trudy Finch unpinned a wool scarf from her own throat and held it half a breath like something alive. Then she offered it out, eyes low, and Lila took it like a child takes the weather changing. The long table grew heavier under the weight of what people could spare. The ring lay in the middle of it, catching lamplight like a small sun that had decided to winter indoors. Wilkes's gaze rested on the circle and then moved to Virgil's open hand, the one he'd laid palm flat on the wood. Whitcomb's fingers loosened on the edge of the table, merchant sense backing off from its own corner. Virgil looked around just enough to let the room see he'd seen them. He didn't make much of it. He wasn't built to. "They knocked. I opened. That's all," he said, and it sounded like a fence post speaking, plain, plumb, sufficient. Then the hall went to a held quiet. Frost-white breaths showed and faded. The lamps had their say in a low, steady hiss. 20 heartbeats and 5 more passed with nobody adding a stitch to what had already been sewn. When the silence had worn all the way smooth, shoulders eased, boots found softer ways to stand. Reverend Amos closed his hand over the Bible like a blessing that didn't need announcing. The marshal shifted, satisfied. The room remembered its manners. Trudy's mouth let go of its pinched line. Whitcomb nodded once to no one in particular, as if a column had balanced he hadn't hoped for. Wilkes looked less like arithmetic and more like a man considering weather. Virgil didn't reach for the ring. He left it where folks could see what a private thing looks like when it goes to work in public. If talk had needed buying, the price had been met. He reckoned that was enough for one night. "Much obliged," he said, not to the men at the table or the lamps or the law, but to the part of a town that had remembered itself, and to the little girl who had said just what needed saying and no more. They left the hall into a night scrubbed clean of talk. Stars hung low and bright like someone had hammered nails through the dark to keep it from sagging. Boots ground the snow to glassy grit. At the door, Reverend Amos caught Virgil's hand and pressed the ring into his palm without ceremony. "Belongs where promises live," he said, "and let the cold take him." They walked slow, man, girl, boy, each carrying what the town had set down. Flour, beans, a length of dry wood Zeke had insisted couldn't be trusted to any man but the one who'd burn it. Virgil lifted Toby when the boy's steps shortened. The child leaned against his neck, warm as a pocket. Lila kept the doll tucked close, the ribbon empty now, eyes bright, as if that small vacancy had made more room for light. The draw met them with its old sounds, the wire on the north line humming a satisfied low, not asking for help tonight. The air held that clean, iron-cold smell you taste more than breathe. Virgil shouldered the door. The hinge gave its long, homely whine, and the shack breathed out its welcome. Inside, the stove had slept, but not forgotten them. Virgil fed it careful, set Zeke's wood like it was meant for this mouth and no other. Flame took polite, then eager. He turned the ring in his muck fingers, feeling where the gold had learned every ridge of the woman who'd worn it. That knowing hadn't thinned with time. He drove a small tack above the door frame and hung the wedding ring there where a man would see it on his way in and out. A new place for a new promise. The metal caught the fire and returned it softly over the room. Not bright, just steady. Lila watched, hands folded around the doll. Then she rose on her toes and set the doll on the shelf facing the fire, like one more soul taking its rightful seat. For a piece of time nobody spoke. You could count 20 heartbeats and 5 more while firelight spilled across the snow just outside the threshold, while the fence outside kept its low music and the stove drew a slow, soft breath through its vent. The quiet didn't press. It lifted. Lila touched the scarf at her neck, the one Trudy had unpinned, then looked up. "We don't have to leave, do we?" Virgil had words, enough for the line that mattered, and none to waste on the rest. He looked at the ring above the door, at the fire, at the 2 small faces eased by both. "Not so long as I've got breath." He tipped the flour sack from his shoulder to the table and added half to the stove and half to the night. "Much obliged to this life yet." Toby's head found sleep against his collarbone, small weight that felt like an answer. Lila eased the quilt up and over her brother, then smoothed the edge with a care learned the hard way. Virgil slid the beans into a pot, let them think about boiling. He stood a moment with his palm on the warm stove lid, feeling the heat cross into bone. Plain heat, honest, earned. Outside, the wind walked the fence and found no purchase. The ring above the door borrowed the flame and gave it back in a thin, good circle. The shack held 3 kinds of light now, the lamps, the fires, and the one that shows up when a man says he will and then does. He reckoned that was enough for winter. The room settled. Breath evened. Snow crunched once under some night thing's step and then forgot to go on. Virgil sat, not because he was beaten, but because he could. Work would come at daybreak, wire checks, water, the long habit of living, but the house had fire, word, and people. That would do. He let the quiet run its course again, 15 counts, then 10 more, and watched the ring hold the light like it meant to keep it. The night closed around Willow Draw and did its best imitation of peace. And for the first time in a long spell, Virgil Hart felt the world lean his way just enough a man could stay. Out here nights come honest and the wind says exactly what it means. But a house with fire, a ring over the door, and 2 small breaths sleeping easy, that's a kind of mercy you can feel in your hands. If this story warmed you a little after it hurt, let us know simple as snow. Drop an in the comments. If you felt the cold first, but stayed for the promise, drop a 0. Either way, I'm glad you rode with us this far. Tip your hat to the trail ahead. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next campfire tale from the old country of Wyoming wind and stubborn hearts. We'll keep the stove fed, the fence straight, and the stories coming. Saddle up with us for the next ride.